Hello everyone, and thank you for attending today's webinar, Dynamical Simulation of EBSD Patterns. Before we begin, I'd like to cover a couple of housekeeping items. At the bottom of your audience console are several application widgets you can use. If you have any questions during the session, you can click on the Q&A widget and submit your question. We'll try to answer these at the end of the webcast, but if a fuller answer is needed or we run out of time, you'll receive an answer via email. A copy of today's slide deck is included in the resource list widget that looks like a green folder. You can expand your slide area by clicking on the maximize icon on the top right or by dragging the bottom right corner of the slide area. If you have any technical difficulty, please click on the Help widget. It has a question mark icon and covers common technical issues. And finally, an on-demand version of the webcast will be available approximately one day after the session ends today, and it can be accessed using the same audience link that was sent to you earlier. And now I'd like to introduce Dr. Stuart Wright, who is our presenter for today's webinar. Stuart was first introduced to EBSD as an undergraduate student at Brigham Young University, working with the first system in North America. He then moved on to Yale University to pursue a PhD under Professor Brent Adams. His thesis research focused on automating the EBSD technique. This effort led to the first fully automated EBSD scans in the fall of 1991. After graduating, Stuart joined Los Alamos National Lab and continued work in microtexture and texture analysis using both the OIM technique and conventional X-ray diffraction. Shortly after TSL was founded, Stuart left Los Alamos and joined the startup company commercializing the OIM technique, working primarily on software development. He has continued in this role through the purchase of TSL by EDAX. The original OIM system at Yale could index approximately one pattern in 3 seconds. Modern systems have come a long way since those early days, with speeds now exceeding 4,500 index patterns per second. Stuart is closely involved in the continued development of the technique, as well as in working with scientists all over the world in applying the technique to their materials research. And now over to you, Stu.
Thank you. Welcome to all those who have joined in today. I'm glad you're here, and hopefully what I share with you today will be helpful to you in your research. My last webinar I looked a little bit backwards, but today we're looking a little bit forwards at some of the new things we're doing with dynamic pattern simulation. And right now we've been working on developing these tools within the framework of our OIM analysis software. And I'll focus on 3 applications of dynamic pattern simulation, namely dictionary indexing, optimizing the reflector list for indexing conventionally, and then also simulating backgrounds, which hopefully can help in some of the areas you're working at. And then just wrap up with a quick summary and conclusions at the end. So before I get started, I want to make sure that I acknowledge several folks. This work is while the dynamic pattern simulation is not my work, it's work of others who have done some terrific stuff to get us started in this arena. Most notably, Imo Winkelmann, who, while at the Max Planck Institute in Halle, developed dynamic pattern simulation that gave some really simulations that really started to look like experimental patterns. And also following up, Mark de Graef's work at Carnegie Mellon University, who's also continued in that vein with a slightly different approach. In terms of the dictionary indexing, which we'll be talking about, once again, that comes out of Mark de Graef's group with quite a few other folks working on a dictionary approach, and I'll explain what I mean by dictionary indexing later. And then Reflector Optimization, once again, it's work with Mark's group and Singh that I did really just early or at the end of last year. And we'll talk more about those. I just want to make sure that those folks get credit for the great work they've done. So let's go ahead and get started with an introduction to pattern simulation. Originally, we've done a lot with kinematic simulation, and that was kind of the basis for a lot of the early work in EBSD in terms of figuring out which reflectors we need to consider And it's a pretty simple approach using atomic scattering. And you just look at where the atoms are located in the unit cell, and you're able to then predict what a pattern would look like. And just an example was given there at left. And we assume the intensity that is in the patterns is a function of the structure factor. And you can see that if those of you have seen electron backscatter diffraction patterns, that doesn't look a lot like an experimental pattern, even though it does give the band locations and some approximation of the intensity. And as an example, this next slide shows an experimental pattern at left and a kinematic simulation at right for the same orientation. And you can see that, yes, some of the general ideas there, but it doesn't look anything like an experimental pattern. So dynamic simulation, in this case, in this example here, I'm using Mark de Graef's code. And I should note that Mark de Graef has some of this is available as open source codes that I'm using here. And what we're doing is adapting those ideas into OAM analysis to just make it more convenient. So we start with a Monte Carlo simulation of all the electrons within the crystal structure. In this case, we're using 2 billion electrons. And from that, we calculate a master pattern. It's actually on a sphere, this master pattern, covering all of orientation space. But to aid in make it more efficient in terms of computation, we project that sphere onto a square using something called the Lambda Projection. This makes it much easier to analyze, as in computer we like to use nice square grids, makes things go faster. And so from that master pattern, along with the Monte Carlo simulation results, then you can create an individual pattern for any given EBSD detector geometry and any crystallographic orientation. And that orientation can be given, say, in terms of Euler angles, and an orientation matrix, Rodriguez vector, quaternions, whatever kind of mode that you like to use. So as an example, there's an experimental pattern here on the left, a dynamic simulation in the middle, and a kinematic simulation on the right. And you can see that the experimental pattern and the dynamic simulation look quite a bit alike. You can see some details around the poles, at the edges of the bands, and there's definitely a lot going on there, and it matches quite closely to the experimental pattern, which is great. It allows us then to do some things that we couldn't do before with just the kinematic simulation. The simulations are good, but they're not perfect. For example, if you did a band profile across that experimental pattern versus one for a kinematic simulation, you can see that the band profiles are a little bit different. We know what causes this, and some of this can be corrected, but once again, the more you correct and the more functions you put into the model, of course, the more the computation takes a hit and takes longer to do. So depending on what we're doing, we may do a full model, whereas others will take some assumptions to speed things up to meet the needs of whatever application we're looking at. So just as an aside, the example I showed for kinematic simulation basically showed the maximum, the bands according to the maximum intensities for a family of bands. Say, for example, the 111, 222, 323, 444, we just take the maximum for those. We could use a summing approach and use all those bands, and that's what I'm showing now in the example at left. Yeah, it looks a little better, but compared to the dynamic simulation, it's nowhere near captures the same, especially the band intensities, as well as we see the kinematical simulation does. And also doesn't capture the detail around the zone axes nearly as well. So while we can make it look a little prettier, it doesn't really help us in our comparing against experimental. So just I'll be showing a few screenshots. We are implementing this in OIM analysis. This is new and it's subject to change as we polish it up and get it ready for release to our customer base. So that's very nice, but there's more to it than just being able to compare patterns by eye. So let's look at some of the things we can do with these simulated patterns. We'll first focus on dictionary indexing. So the first thing you do when you do dictionary indexing is you have to create the dictionary. So from the master pattern, we calculate a dictionary of patterns for all, in parentheses, orientations. And we have to decide on that what all means based on a sampling of orientation space, which I'll come back to. So in this example here, I've got quite a few orientations, and for each orientation, we calculate a pattern, and we store that in a dictionary I'm representing by folder. And what we do now to do dictionary indexing is we take an experimental pattern, we compare it against all the patterns in the dictionary and find the one that from the dictionary that it matches most closely. And so we use this using a dot product of we turn basically a pattern, all the pattern intensities in a pattern at each pixel into a column vector and normalize that vector. Do the same with the experimental pattern and then just look at the dot product. And the one that has the largest dot product in is the best match, and that's the technique we use to compare those. And it works, which is great. So first let's talk about sampling orientation space. We need to uniformly cover all of orientation space, which is not a trivial exercise. If you were to use Euler angles, that becomes very difficult, and so there's different approaches to doing that. The output could be 3 Euler angles, but like I said, we could use any orientation representation we want. Sampling is done in the examples I'm giving here using a cubic sampling approach, which provides us a fairly uniform coverage of orientation space. And what we do is we enter a target spacing, misorientation between sampling points in orientation space. So as an example, here's a 15-degree target misorientation plotted in Rodriguez space, and you can see then the little dots showing which orientations are in their space there. But that's not going to be fine enough for dictionary indexing, which is a point I'll come back to. Here's a 5-degree spacing. You can see we've got quite a bit more, better coverage of orientation space. And as another example, here's 2.5 degrees. If I go beyond that, it just turns black, basically. So I won't go any further. But this just shows in cubic, for cubic symmetry, you can see the coverage. And it's uniform in cubic Cork space. I'm showing it in Rodriguez space. Hopefully some of you are familiar with that. And it won't be perfectly uniform in that space, but it just shows you an example of how we're covering the orientation space with our sampling technique. The dictionary size is something to consider. So I've been showing examples for cubic. You can see there for cubic symmetry, depending upon the target misorientation, it starts to go, the number of patterns goes up quickly. So if I go to 0.2 to 5 degrees in my graph there, I'm up to 100 million orientations. You can see if I go to triclinic symmetry, that goes up even more rapidly, and it becomes difficult then to do these very, very fine grids for the lower symmetries. But you can do it. It just takes patience and computing power. So as an example, I'm going to show you, this is the one we've kind of used the most, and you may have seen it in some recent papers. So this is, what we've done is we've scanned the same area on a nickel sample, but we're increasing the gain each time, and increasing the gain on the camera is a way it increases the noise in the patterns. So we're trying to investigate how well the dictionary indexing works as a function of noise. So in this case, some details. There are 60 by 60 pixel patterns, which has been found to be a good resolution for doing dictionary indexing. It's actually a little smaller than we would typically use for the conventional Huff-based indexing, but it works quite well with 60 by 60 pixel patterns in dictionary indexing, both in terms of the results and in terms of the efficiency of computation. We've done 10 scans with the camera gains going between 0 and the maximum available on the camera. I won't go into how we measure the noise, but you can just see that it increases with increasing gain. We've also tried other image processing techniques on these as part of a larger study. And so we've done this template matching approach or dictionary approach on these. So we have a reference scan that we can compare our results to, and that's the scan we obtained at 0 gain. So we'll use that as a reference and compare the others against that to see how well this is working. All these use constant beam increment so that the noise would go up and so what that means is we have to increase the exposure as we go to lower gains. Anyway, here's the results, at least for 4 of those of the 10 tests. You can see using the standard Huff-based indexing is the top row. So that nice as scanned one at the top left is our reference scan. you can see as we increase the gain, it gets the patterns get noisy, but so does the resulting orientation map that we're showing. In fact, when we get out to a gain of 36, it's essentially just random noise. We have used our MPAR technique, and you can see the results there, but that's not the focus of today's webinar. The dictionary technique, you can see it does a really good job, both at 0 gain, 29.3, 30.4, and even at 36, we're getting a recognizable microstructure, and it's doing a really good job. In fact, it even picks up some of those minor twins, which is pretty impressive, especially in the one just left of and down of center. You can see there's 2 twins, one very small, and it's actually capturing that. So it's doing a nice job handling that noise better than the other techniques. So this is a blow-up of one of them. The slices, you can see the fidelity of the measurements. This is done with a dictionary calculated every 2 degrees. It took about 20 minutes on the computer I'm using to do this dictionary indexing. This could be definitely done faster with other approaches, and I would refer you to some of the work that Mark Graef's done to explore the speed issue. The dictionary build actually took a lot longer than the dictionary indexing. It takes a little bit of time to load everything into memory, but once you calculate a dictionary, you can use it over and over. So that initial investment of time in the dictionary isn't as critical because it's a one-time calculation. So just to quantify those results, the ISR stands for indexing success rate. This is just showing the indexing success rate, and I won't go into how we measure that, but you can see just with the raw Huff indexing, it drops off quickly with noise, getting down to about 5% in that very last pattern compared to the reference is how we're measuring that success. And then the green is the dictionary indexing, and you can see we're at 75% in those very noisy patterns of results. So it's doing a great job getting us quite good results. So just a note about that I've been thinking about a little bit is what is the minimum spacing we can handle in the dictionary. You can see the Huff-based result left there, and this is of the nicest patterns. This is with 0 gain. You can see 2.5 degree dictionary, and you can see a 5 degree dictionary. And you can see when we get to 5 degrees, we've already, it's too large to really get good results. So 2.5 degrees seems to be a good number. I didn't explore it too much further. And you can also see that in those inner dot product maps below. The inner dot product then, 1 means it's a perfect match between the experimental pattern and the dictionary pattern, whereas blue, 0 would be no match. In this case, the minimum was about 0.8. And you can see then that the numbers, those match numbers, the inner dot products drop quite a bit as you see a lot more blue in the one for the dictionary indexing at 5 degrees. Just to show how well that you get a better match the finer grid spacing you have, which you would expect. So dictionary size, just some things to think about. Dictionaries are large for small angular resolution. They're larger for low symmetry materials. And if you consider the case where you have multi-phase materials, then if you've got 2 phases, it's going to take you 2 different dictionary indexings through, so it will also increase the time. So both indexing and building the dictionary are computationally intensive. So what would be a minimum spacing that we could achieve? Well, you can kind of look at that if you look at the dot product distributions. This is work from a paper I noted earlier by Singh and Mark de Graef on they looked at the cubic Cork sampling. And so here's the inner dot products. And you can see between 2 patterns, and it tracks well with misorientations up to about 3 degrees. So the dot product and the misorientation are correlated. Once you get beyond about 3 degrees, it starts to fall apart. And so we assume that about 3 degrees is a good result. That seems to confirm well with the 2.5 degrees that I looked at in that previous case. I took a look at comparing simulated patterns versus simulated patterns and experimental patterns versus experimental patterns. And I did get a similar result, albeit with the average dot products much lower for the experimental patterns. And this just shows that value of about 3 degrees looks to be probably the coarsest dictionary that we could probably handle. I did mention multi-phase samples. And so here's an example using a 2-degree dictionary. I've done it on a very low resolution map just so you can see the details. So we're looking at a simple duplex steel with an FCC and a BCC phase, the FCC in blue. And you can see in the Huff base that the edges or the interfaces between the two phases are a little bit rougher. So that compared to the dictionary results, suggesting that the dictionary results give us a little bit better deconvolution of the patterns, or in the cases where we have mixed patterns at the interfaces between the two different phases, which is an interesting result. Just so you know, the multi-phase work has been done on some geological materials. I refer you to the paper by Marquardt, which is a really nice paper showing dictionary results on geologic materials. It does take some patience as those dictionaries are big. These geological materials tend to be lower symmetry. And then also some good work by Ferengus Ram, also looking at phase differentiation. Now, as I mentioned, this dictionary calculations do take some time compared to the Huff, even though they are getting faster with other techniques, which I will mention later. But here's original scan that I've done, and then I went and did the dictionary on it after. So the original is the Huff-based, the standard Huff-based approach. The 2.5-degree dictionary you see there. You can see the CI map is really poor for this data, as you might expect. I did do CI standardization, which is a technique we can use to upgrade the confidence index based on the neighbors. Comparing, it doesn't change the orientations, it only changes the confidence index. And we do that to really get a better idea of the confidence index after the fact during some post-processing technique. If you have questions on this, I can send you some good resources to look at. Anyway, my point is I wanted to look at the CI distribution of the points that were changed, so points that were changed by dictionary indexing. So some points were the same and some points were different. And we wanted to look at the ones that were changed or modified by the dictionary indexing. And you'll notice, if you look at the changed ones in red, the majority of those are the low confidence index points, less than, in this case, looks like about 0.5. So what we could do is only perform the dictionary indexing on the points where the confidence index is low. We will miss a few because there were a few high confidence index points that were changed by the dictionary indexing approach. And it turns out those are about 1.6% if we use a cutoff of the confidence index less than 0.1. So the idea here is that you would look at your confidence index at each pixel in the map, do a confidence index standardization, improve those, filter out the ones that have a low confidence index. In this case, I've selected 0.1. And you can see then those are the points in black in the map. And we're just going to do the dictionary indexing on those points in black to improve the indexing. And if you do that, then you have on the left column there, you have the confidence index for all the points from the standard indexing. So confidence index greater than 0.1, and then we do the dictionary indexing on those points with confidence index less than 0.1. You merge the two together, and you get something that looks quite a bit like the dictionary indexing result for this data that's pretty poor. So this speeds up the process. We don't have to do the dictionary indexing on all the points in the map. So we use a kind of a selective approach based on the confidence index. So here's the confidence index after the filtering approach on the left, and here's the result using just dictionary indexing on everything. And we actually seem to get a little bit better result. In some cases, other areas, if you look in detail, you lose it. Now, the nice thing you'll notice about using, one of the weaknesses of using a coarse grid is then that the minimum misorientation we're going to measure is going to be about half the grid size. And so you can see some blockiness in the dictionary indexing results. If you note the large purple grain at the center, at the top of the top of the map, you'll see in the dictionary indexing approach that it's somewhat blocky and it's a little bit smoother than the Huff indexing. You can improve that in the dictionary indexing using a finer grid or using an orientation refinement approach, which I won't go into any details here, but it is a possibility. Now, we've also looked at the deformed magnesium sample. So in this case, it's a very difficult sample to get good results on. In this case, we use a little bit larger pixel patterns in the collection, even though we used the 60 by 60 in the dictionary indexing. So you can see that the data is good, but it is sparse. It's not perfect. And even our NPAR didn't provide too much improvement, which is my point here is that the NPAR gave us only about a 3.5% improvement in this case. So we decided to explore it with dictionary indexing. And this is work I've done, but also some colleagues that I've worked with on the NLPAR work, which we did a recent paper there. I've also tried it, and they got similar results. So this is the dictionary indexing. In this case, I used 2.5 degrees, and you can see that it really didn't improve the results. And maybe with a finer step size, we could get a little bit better results. This is pretty new work, and we're still exploring what things we can do to improve the dictionary results in this case. And I should say that there was a nice paper by Farangus Ram, who also looked at deformed materials, and she got better results than I'm showing here. But just to show you that it does require some thinking, and that it isn't an end-all. And my guess in this case is that we needed to go to higher mag so that we could reduce, hopefully, the size of the interaction volume and get a little better results. But just as a summary, you can see here we used the conventional, we tried the NPAR, we tried the NPAR merged with the conventional, tried the dictionary, and the NPAR, and everything all merged, and you can see that in the end we do get good results using all these techniques together. And this is one advantage of doing everything in OM analysis is we do have that flexibility to play with things in this way. And just as an example, here's some screenshots of the way dictionary indexing is implemented in OM analysis. Just as a kind of summary and conclusion, the dictionary method does seem to work really well, especially when the patterns are poor. And higher efficiencies can be achieved with using the CI filtering. Coupling it with NPAR and other image processing techniques can also improve the results. It is slower compared to regular indexing, particularly as you go to finer and finer sampling of orientation space and for lower symmetries. But one thing I really want to emphasize is that, yes, it does a great job with poor patterns, but that's no excuse to take shortcuts on sample preparation. The better patterns you start with, the better your results will be. And besides that, your sample preparation should be such that the microstructure you're looking at is representative of the microstructure in the sample and not an artifact of your sample preparation. So don't take any shortcuts. There are some exciting future directions. If you look at the literature, there's some good work by Winkelmann and Gerrit Nolze on resolving pseudosymmetry problems, and I know others are looking at that. Orientation refinement I mentioned briefly. So instead of using a grid, use the grid to find out original orientation and then sample around that in a refinement approach to get to more exact orientation measurements so you don't get the blockiness in the results. Blockiness in orientation space, I should say. And then ideas for more efficient computation schemes to do these in spectral space as opposed to the direct space that we're using now. I think there's some neat things on the horizon for that as well. So that kind of concludes the dictionary indexing part of my presentation. The next part I want to look at is reflector optimization, something I've been concerned about for a long time, so I'm kind of excited to see some new results coming from the dynamic pattern simulation for that. So if you get a new material, one of the challenges you have when you do EBSD is how do I index it? How do I get the information I need to do the indexing? And basically you have to prepare your sample, capture some good EBSD patterns, and then build a structure file that you're going to use in indexing. So what information do I need to index a pattern? Well, you need to know the symmetry. In general, we just recommend you need to know the point group, but for other reasons you may need more information. You need to know the lattice parameters, and you need to know the reflectors. Often you can find the symmetry information, the lattice parameter information, but what can be difficult is to find the HKLs, the reflectors, the HKLs of the reflectors that will produce the bands in the pattern, at least the most prominent bands. Now, there's lots of ways to do this. You can look at the different databases that EBSD companies supply. You can beg, borrow, and steal. Maybe your colleagues have already worked on the material you're looking at. There's third-party databases, which are great, but a lot of times they're X-ray based, and so they need optimization for EBSD, and this basically surf the web. So once you've found that information, I won't go into any detail here, just to say that if we need atom positions, we're going to have to go all the way to the space group, which I'll come back to. So there's two ways to create a structure file. Often the results don't quite match the X-ray, so you're going to have to play with things. But if you have a list of reflectors, say from X-ray or from somebody's giving you some from EBSD, you need to just specify the symmetry, the lattice parameters, and you enter the most likely HKLs based on some structure factor or other parameter. You manually activate which ones you think are most likely, and then you usually have to do an iterative optimization step comparing the reflectors against an experimental pattern. If you have atomic positions, it makes it a little better. You can specify the space group, the lattice parameters, enter those atom positions, calculate the structure factors, and then go through the same kind of procedure you went through with the manually entered values. The atomic position method generally gets you closer to the real result. So why do we need to do this optimization step? Well, the diffraction, we know the kinematical model is not perfect, and so we have to do some optimization. If you're using X-ray results for your reflectors, we know X-rays behave differently than electrons. The physics are different, so we need to optimize for electron backscatter diffraction. And then the observed material you may be looking at may differ from that used to create the entry in the database, so maybe you need to play with that a little bit. And then the other key is that the selected reflectors need to correlate to the bands found by the Huff transform. So then there's that, you bring that into the mix as well. So as an example, here's an example from quartz. We had some X-ray results, we had some kinematic simulated results, and then you can see what we actually observed in EBSD. And those are kind of in order of intensity. And so you see they don't match up one-to-one between any of those. So thus we require an optimization step. And that can be difficult for some materials, especially those with lower symmetry. You got to make sure your band detection is working, your system's well calibrated. But the question we had then is, can we use dynamic pattern simulation? Can we automate this? Can we simplify this? So we took a look at that. And so we're going to compare kinematic results versus dynamic results versus those using Huff peaks, the intensities from a set of simulated patterns, and see how well these all correlate. So for the dynamically simulated patterns, what we're going to do is we're going to pick a band and a certain width, and then sum the intensity across that. And using that as a parameter we call beta, and we can sum these intensities. So it's a little bit different than using the structure factor. So we go into the experimental patterns, albeit on the sphere, or on the simulated patterns, albeit on the sphere, and get the full summation. Now for the Huff transform, we're going to use the most intense bands, and I'll come back to this a little bit, as found by the Huff transform. So we do this with a set of patterns, and we get some results. So here's an example for nickel, just using something simple to start with to make sure everything we're doing makes sense. So you can see the HKLs in the left-hand column, and our beta parameter for each HKL, the structure factor, calculated by the kinematic simulation. Those we already had in our file, which I just labeled as manual, and just they're on or off. And then the results from the Huff, and also in this case I have the intensity factors from the X-ray. And you can see things match up pretty well. There is a slight difference. The 220 is predicted to be stronger by the beta, by the beta, whereas it's weaker than the 311 for the structure factor, and that does match the Huff transform results a little bit better, which is a point in our favor, looking at this is going the right direction. So if we go to something a little more complex, rutile, which is tetragonal, you can see the results there. Things do match up. You're starting to see some things that are a little bit interesting. If you look at that 521 band, about 2/3 of the way down, it is found by the Huff, but it isn't, and it is, the structure factor is stronger for the kinematic than the beta in this fact. So that's one case where it didn't seem to work as well, but in many other cases, if you look at these closely, they do tend to match up better with the beta. And just, oh, I'm sorry, I forgot the slide. There's the one I was talking about. So we took a look at the experimental pattern, and you can see the results here. The dynamic predicted there in the middle on the top row shows, if you look there, there's a blue band about 3/4 of the way down, kind of just below horizontal. If you look at the kinematic, the band above it, which is close to parallel, is picked from kinematic. If I were to do it manually, I would probably pick both of them. But if you do the Huff transform, it actually found the one that matches the dynamic. So that's kind of a good point. that this beta will give us what we're looking for. So we started to think about this a little more and realized that it's not really the intensity of the Huff peaks that we're interested in, it's really the frequency. How often is that a peak from that family? And so that becomes more interesting, and we start to use that as a comparison instead of the height of Huff peaks. Now, going back to our rutile, we're actually going to now look at experimental patterns and see how well these things match up. And if you look there, you can see the results both for the beta and the structure factor F simulation results, and then you can see the frequencies there. And once again, that 5-2 band does show up strong still as a high frequency band, and it does mix things up a little bit and has us thinking about what all this means. So once again, I did a cubic Cork sampling orientation space. In this case, we don't need a fine one, we just need a coarse one. We just need an approximate. So we went with 10-degree target misorientations. And so you can see this is a busy plot. Couldn't figure out a better way to present it, but you can see the dynamical ranking is the black solid line, the kinematical is gray, the Huff detection frequency on the simulated patterns is the dotted line, the dashed line is the Huff detection frequency on the experimental patterns. And so you can see everything tends to follow. There is a funny one at 310 where the Huff finds something that's very strong that the others don't find, and I'm still struggling trying to figure that one out, but just to show you the results there, that in general things do go the way we expect. For something a little more difficult, this shows the value, I think, of doing these dynamic simulations. This is Stuart Wright and Olivine Series, so you can have a magnesium rich versus an iron rich, and so I've simulated them for magnesium only, iron only, and then a 50% split between the two. And you can see if you just look at that 311, you can see the differences in that. And we can use that information then hopefully to maybe get it better what's going on in our material by looking at the balance between the magnesium and iron in these simulations. As a proviso, you need to think about the Huff. The Huff settings can affect these results. In particular, let's say you tune the Huff towards narrow bands versus wide bands, you're going to get different results. And so the Huff ranking will also of the bands will vary with the Huff settings. And so you kind of have to play with that and experiment to get the best results. So once again, you have the difference in the patterns in the dynamic and in the Huff parameters that you're using. So you really do need to do a sanity check on the experimental patterns you're looking at. And so we can use the beta to get closer to where we want to be, but then compare it with the Huff and make sure things match up to get the best results we can. And it just shows the idea of using a dynamic pattern simulation for more than just the dictionary indexing, but it can be used for others. So once again, I won't go through that summary again. Let's go to the last point there. The last 2 points, the reflector selection, whether you use kinematic or dynamic, it's just good practice to confirm them with experimental patterns. So kind of the approach we've taken is to set up the Huff to find the bands in experimental patterns, create a set of dynamically simulated patterns, test the Huff on the simulated patterns to optimize the reflector list, and then finally confirm those results on the experimental patterns. And this will give us probably our best results that we can get to get started with indexing a new material. So that wraps up what I wanted to say about the optimization of the reflector list. I want to move on now to the background process. So I think, as most everyone knows, collected EBSD patterns don't look like the ones we see, in our marketing materials or in people's papers, wherever it is. They're usually not nearly as high contrast. And if you look closely, it appears that basically you have bands superimposed on an intensity gradient. And the gradient usually goes from the center or near the center of where you have high contrast in the pattern out to the edges where it gets weaker and weaker. And this has to just do with the signal and the way the data is collected. So uncorrected, this can be difficult to index these patterns. And so you can see here the Huff transform, there's a lot of artifacts there, and the actual bands are very weak. The peaks corresponding to the bands are very weak. And you can see the indexing can still actually work. The Huff does a remarkable job at times. But how can we improve the patterns? Well, one is to use what we call a static background processing approach. The idea here is we collect a pattern from one point in our microstructure, but then we collect patterns from all of the points in the microstructure, say, or all of the grains, say 25 or more grains. This slide is the one we use in our training courses, and I'll come back to why I'm using it here. And so then you take one and you subtract it or divide it, and you end up with a pattern that looks like that, where the bands then pop right out. You can see them well, and so can the Huff, and that helps us index. Now there's another approach we call dynamic background processing. And in this approach, once again, we collect the pattern from the point, a little nicer in this case. We smooth out that pattern, we blur it. And this can be done just kind of a smoothing approach, or you can do it in frequency space using, say, bandpass filtering. Anyway, you take that blurred version, you subtract it or divide it from the other, from the original pattern, and you get something that's nice. This can be quite helpful if you have single crystals where it's very difficult to get a static background. You can do it for rough surfaces where that background is going to be changing. That gradient will move around because of the roughness of the surface. Or multi-phase samples where the signal is maybe stronger for one phase than another phase. One thing to watch out for is if you have any defects on the phosphor screen. I've used one with quite a few defects just to emphasize it here. You can see little points that remain there because they're in both, because the blur doesn't get rid of them. The background doesn't have them. So you can use this. It's a little bit slower because you've got to do more processing at each point, but it can also be used as static correction to get to a very nice result. Now, if you think about multi-phase samples, then let's say I have one for aluminum high up on the periodic table versus tantalum. Lower down, you can see the tantalum has more contrast. These are done at the same exposure time and new image processing to emphasize the differences between the two. So the aluminum patterns will need a different background than what you would need for tantalum patterns. Well, if you simulate this, which you can do, the first column, I've simulated tantalum and I've simulated aluminum on the left. And the simulations now, we do them at the same intensity. So you can see that the aluminum pattern is weaker than the tantalum pattern. If we were to do a little image processing, just stretching the intensity histogram so that the min and max scale to the black and white, then you can see they look similar in intensity even though there's a lot more detail in the tantalum pattern. Now if I average those patterns out, I average 500 of them, you can see the tantalum at the top and simulated aluminum at the bottom. Then you can see they look pretty similar. There's a gradient. But one thing I want to point out is that gradient is not constant. It is not the same for the tantalum and aluminum. Even if you were to normalize the intensity, it actually differs. In fact, if we divide the tantalum by the aluminum, the two simulated background patterns, you can see there is a gradient remaining. So even though we could kind of simulate or we could use kind of the same background, we wouldn't quite get the optimal results because the gradients are slightly different. And that just has to do with the physics of scattering. So the question I had is, could we use a simulated background? So here's our raw pattern on the left. We do our standard background correction using an experimental background. You see that in the middle. And then we do it using a simulated background. And you can see very little difference between the one in the middle and the one on the right, which tells us that we can use simulated backgrounds for these materials, which is a nice thing to have. So let's say we had a structure like this where we have two different phases. I could use a different background for each phase. In this case, I would have to have some other way of differentiating the phases so that I know which background to use. In this case, maybe we have chemistry that we've collected EDS data simultaneously, and then we can use that to be able to differentiate the two. But usually this isn't the problem. Those kind of samples are relatively easy to do. Maybe a more difficult one is something like this, where in this case I've got some tungsten moly particles within a nickel matrix. And so we went ahead and indexed it for nickel, and we can't get very good results for these particles. But we could use simulated patterns for these, or just go collect backgrounds and play around with them a little differently and change the intensities. And if you do that, you can get a good result. And this is kind of a more typical challenging problem to do with backgrounds. But we can use simulated backgrounds for that, and you can get a good result. Now, the question I wanted to look at, I brought up, these are our standard training slides. I've always said in that slide that we needed 25 or more grains to get a good background. So my question is that true? So using simulated patterns, here's 6,656 simulated patterns averaged together. It's nice and smooth. If I go to 25, you can actually see that's probably not enough. We still see bands within the average of those 25 patterns. If we go to 500, it's pretty smooth. And in fact, if we go ahead and I used my 6,656 as a standard, and you can see you get to about 100 patterns and it flattens out, and we could use maybe 100 patterns, even though it is a little rough, but it's pretty easy for us to simulate more than that. And so that kind of answers the question I had. In fact, the codes can actually, you don't have to go through the process of averaging patterns, you can just pull out the average, or a simulated background pattern. But just to show, we have the ability to simulate backgrounds, and then you can pull those into the reindexing routine so that you can use the right background. If you have some other thing like I suggested, EDS results to decide which background you use for which patterns. So that can really help get more reliable results. So just in summary, there's lots of different ways to do this, but the points in red are the points I wanted to make. Multi-phase samples, you can get better results if you treat the background separately for each phase, and it turns out we can use simulated backgrounds for that. And averaging patterns over a larger area improves background correction, which isn't a surprise, but something that maybe you think about. It kind of reaffirms what we've always suggested that you should think about when you collect data in a conventional manner. So one of the things we've shown is that the simulated patterns, not only can they give us access to new indexing routines, but they can help improve our standard way of working as well. So hopefully what I've shown you is that dictionary indexing shows some promising points to some promising approaches for the future for improving our indexing of some of our more difficult samples. Even for standard, like I said, indexing, we can optimize the reflector selection process. We can use it to generate backgrounds. And this is still all, we're just learning. And so I think there'll be new areas in the areas of, say, phase ID, resolving pseudosymmetry problems, and I'm sure other areas that we haven't anticipated yet that will give us some exciting results for the future. So with that, I'll just show you some of the resources that we have if you want to find more details, and we'll take a look at some of your questions. Thanks for listening in today, and hopefully what we've been able to do is give you some good results. One question we had was on studying duplex fields where you have both multiple phases. I do think it can help in this situation. Usually with stills, the traditional indexing works pretty well, but perhaps there are cases where you're having difficulties and maybe it can improve some of those results. I'm hoping that in the future, like I mentioned, pseudosymmetry, that Martensite's obviously something we've all been interested in over the years, and I'm hoping that we'll find new ways to maybe approach the Martensite problem with the dictionary indexing. In terms of another question we had was which version of OIM allows dynamical pattern simulation? It is still being worked on. We hope to maybe release it by the end of the year, although I must admit I can't make any promises at this point. There's still a few things we're working through. But as you saw, there are some of the screenshots. We are making good progress and are getting close. And basically, we're having fun playing with it before we send it out for everybody to use, make sure we understand when it will work and when it doesn't and how we can help folks with that. Highly deformed samples, like I said, we're still learning when that works and when it doesn't work for dictionary indexing. Like I said, there's a very good paper by Ferengus Ram I would recommend you look up to get some ideas on what she's experienced, and then we're going to continue working with different samples for ourselves as well, and hopefully we can give you more concrete answers in the future. For the dictionary method, do you need to collect the backgrounds? Another question that has come through. I would say yes, go ahead and collect it. We have done it without the background and with the background, but I haven't really proven it either way, but I have, my gut tells me that we might as well get as good a pattern as we can for the comparison, and the background correction will help with that. Just use the same standard approach to collecting the background and do it, or you could go ahead and use the simulated, either way. both will be available in the software. We do have a question on the CIS, Confidence Index Standardization. That is a routine that's available in the software. I will take a chance to email you actually some results on that. I can't think off the top of my head what's the best resource to give you, but I do have the reference, and there's also information if you have one analysis. There is quite a bit of information in the online help on that. All right. That pretty much, I think, answers the questions that would be of general interest. There are still a few that I will go ahead and respond directly to you on your questions. There was one question on the simulations in terms of the software itself. So we are using what's called the EMSoft, which is available, actually available open source, but we've implemented parts of that into our OIM analysis software, primarily to make it more convenient for the user and using data collected on our either using our OIMDC or team software, and because it's all linked together and flows well. But if you're interested in doing your own, there is that available, and you can just look on the web on the GitHub for EMSoft. And if that's the route you want to take, then I would look into that, and I'm sure those maintaining that can help you with some of the questions you have directly. So with that, we'll close up. I'm glad you listened in, and hopefully you got some good results. If you do have questions later on, please feel free to contact us, and come to our booth at M&M, Microscopy and Microanalysis meeting in August, and we should be able to show you some of this directly on the system and give some better examples of where we're at, and hopefully we'll be able to demo some things for you. So with that, I'll close up, and thanks for all your attention, and look forward to seeing you in the future.